Thank you very much for that. I want to say thanks as well to the Jack Miller Center for support of this, but thanks just in general to everybody at Great Hearts for the opportunity to speak to all of you. Many of our best students at Skettle, the civics program at ASU, actually come from Great Hearts. We can pretty much tell you apart when you get there, so you are doing something good here. And so we are glad to continue this great partnership, focusing on the foundational texts of Western civilization and our constitutional republic. So this is a deferred Constitution Day lecture, and so what I want to do today actually is start by discussing a central and I think underappreciated part of our Constitution, and then since we're celebrating in the next couple of years the 250th anniversary, I want to back up to the American Revolution. And what I want to show is that the United States Constitution indeed reflects the goals and values of the Revolution as expressed in the Declaration of Independence and some of the other revolutionary texts, some of which you'll be discussing shortly afterward. I'm going to argue that to better understand the Constitution, we should understand the Revolution not as Americans overthrowing an evil king, but as a British Civil War about how best to protect political freedom. And that's an understanding that I think has more helpful lessons for us today. So what was the American Revolution about? Most people say taxation without representation. And in a sense, that's true. But that raises the question, if the Americans could just simply sit in Parliament, would that have solved the problem? If you look at the documents we have from the Revolution and their logic that's embedded in the Constitution, the answer is no. Why not? Think about all the decisions that are made in your home. What shows you and your family will watch? Who does which chores? What time you have dinner? What snacks go on the grocery list? What you all do at home? Do you listen to music? Do you do sports or board games? Would you rather all of these rules and routines in your home be set by your family or by a committee of your neighbors who've decided the best way to do these things? On a Friday night, would you rather decide where to go with your group of friends or put it up to a vote among your whole class and try getting everyone to agree? These types of questions illustrate the constitutional idea of federalism. When it comes to setting the rules and routines for your home, your parents and your family probably have more information about you, your preferences, your strengths, and your situation than a neighbor down the block you may have never met. They're more likely to share your values and beliefs about what's important in the world. You have more opportunities to explain things to them, why you'll be late for dinner or out past your bedtime for a particularly anticipated movie premiere. And they're more equipped to make the rules that work out for you or your siblings than your neighbor would be. Of course, there are exceptions. There are certain basic rules that your parents must follow too. They can't just decide not to feed you and look at the grocery bill and just say it's too much this week, right? Similarly, you and your neighbors will want to have rules that make it possible to travel to one another's houses. You all want to drive on the same side of the road. You probably want to have your town maintain a police force to keep you safe. But your family is more involved with you and you with them, and they know more about you and your life situation. So most of the time, it will be them and not your neighbor guiding things at home. And this is the logic of federalism in our Constitution. The division of power between the states, which are closer to the communities, like your family, and the federal government, which is more removed. Under our Constitution, most political powers belong to the states. As the 10th Amendment makes clear, unless a political power is given to the federal government, it's assumed to remain with the states. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. That will be in the pocket constitutions you'll all be getting in a little bit. And this broad authority of the states to regulate on behalf of health, welfare, safety, and morals is called the police power. Police power in this case doesn't mean a nightstick and a badge, which since you folks are classically educated, you'll understand the roots of that are polity or politics. It's why some of the old-timey documents, such as, for example, the Declaration and Resolves we'll be looking at today, use the phrase internal polity. If one reads the documents that the colonists sent to the British government before and during the American Revolution, the violation of this idea of local government was chief among the topics they raised. It was indeed perhaps the central issue of injustice in the eyes of the colonists. Even the famous colonial cry, as I alluded to, about taxation without representation, goes deeper than mere dollars and cents. The actual amount of money, the taxes that were being raised was tiny. Instead, the concern was that the laws should not be imposed on the community from afar. In fact, the colonists were actually okay with some taxation without representation, provided that it was about, for example, international trade. But once Parliament claimed the right to regulate the taxation of their local activities, there was nothing stopping them from regulating all activities. This, the colonists feared, would be the ending of political liberty. In other words, the founders took seriously the belief that the states, rather than a distant central government like Parliament, should be the ones to regulate most of daily life. They remained concerned about this concentrated power wielded from far away, rather than representing the diversity and the local interests of the different states. So turning to our texts for the day, the colonists believe that this basic power to govern, again, is lodged in the local legislatures, with Parliament getting England and foreign policy. This is the source of the disagreement with the British and the Americans. The British believe that everything should be vested in Parliament, Parliament holding all sovereignty over the whole empire, England and the colonies alike. And they think that because they have different lessons from British history. The British think that Parliament is supreme. The Americans think that the lesson is that power needs to be divided. As an example of this, for if you folks are reading John Locke later, that's from the Glorious Revolution of 1688. But this is remembered very differently by the Brits and the Americans. The British understand the lesson to be that Parliament is supreme over an absolute monarch. But there's a strange American theater to that war, in which the colonists kick out a royal governor who had been trying to merge all of the colonies into one central colony that could be more easily controlled by England. So each of them are drawing a very different lesson from the same British history. And this is the core dispute of the American Revolution. You see this beginning with the protests against the Stamp Act in 1765, but the clearest example is the text that you'll all be focusing on today. The 1774 Declaration and Resolves adopted by the First Continental Congress. Everybody knows the Declaration of Independence of the Second Continental Congress, but this is the one from the first, in some sense, the first draft. And one of the things that you see in there at the beginning is they're arguing that rights mostly come from colonial charters, British traditionalism, and constitutionalism, with natural law as a sort of additional explanation. That will get flipped over time. But if you look at this section particularly, I think the most important part of this text is sort of resolution number 4. And I want to dive into that text in a little more detail for a second here. You'll do other parts of it, I know, in your seminars. The foundation of English liberty and all free government is the right of the people to participate in their legislative council. But then they say English colonists are not representative and cannot be properly represented in Parliament. And so they claim a free, and this word choice is really important, exclusive power of legislation in their provincial legislatures over all issues of taxation and internal polity. Basically, everything related to local government, local needs, and most fundamental issues of taxation, they claim are not in Parliament and not even shared with Parliament, but ought to be exclusively held by the colonial governments. And so they say, and this language is really interesting, we cheerfully consent to the actions of the British Parliament related to basically our interactions in foreign policy, our external commerce. We cheerfully consent to that, but we reject the idea that they can raise a revenue from us. Because for them, they are understanding this British Empire to be one that is fundamentally about localism. And they send these messages to the Brits, and the Brits do not seem to get the message. And so over the course of 74, 75, 76, the Americans basically keep sending this message and they keep getting rejected. And so in May of 1776, Congress says to begin getting ready for independence and having the states govern themselves. And so the states begin writing their state constitutions. Hence the Virginia Declaration of Rights by George Mason that you also are looking at. Virginia and Pennsylvania are the first two that start getting this moving. The Virginia Declaration is like the 1774 Declaration and Resolves, a major inspiration for Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. Whereas the Declaration of Rights of Mason includes indictments and some discussions, the Declaration and Resolves includes indictments and some discussions of rights. Mason, who's a mentor to Thomas Jefferson, discusses the political theory of the Declaration of Independence, ideas of social contract, natural rights, individual liberties. And you'll be undoubtedly discussing those in the seminar. But for now, I just want to pause and note that the very idea that George Mason is writing a Declaration of Rights for Virginia illustrates this core idea of the Revolution. Your states are going to be doing most of your governing, and so you need to write constitutions and bills of rights to carefully check them. Another theme is just jumping ahead to the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776. They say the people of the state have the sole, again, here's the word exclusive, an inherent right of governing and regulating their internal police, their local affairs. The Massachusetts Constitution, which is written by John Adams, who I think doesn't get enough credit for that because the Massachusetts Constitution is then the primary inspiration for the U.S. Constitution. But Adams's Constitution to this day declares, the people of this Commonwealth have the sole and exclusive right of governing themselves as a free, sovereign, and independent state, and shall exercise every power not expressly delegated to the United States of America, and so on. And so, as you may know, during most of the Revolution, messages sent from the colonists to the king to stop Parliament's overreach. They keep saying, "King, please stop us from Parliament." The problem, however, is that the king, far from being an autocratic tyrant that's just pushing Parliament around, actually views himself as a defender of British political traditions. And so he sides with Parliament, which is why the Declaration of Independence, unlike the earlier texts, flips and makes him the evil bad guy that's doing everything wrong. The earlier texts had been more aggressive in blaming Parliament. So with this background, it's worth looking anew at the Declaration of Independence, drafted by Thomas Jefferson, with major input from John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, who's my second favorite founder and somebody who is also underappreciated, and Robert Livingston. And when you open up the Declaration of Independence, you'll see nearly identical themes and a list of grievances to the 1774 Declaration and Resolves, especially related to local government by the colonies instead of Parliament and a violation of civil liberties. The major difference, though, is that for the now Americans of 1776 in their Declaration of Independence, they are rooting this mostly in natural law, the laws of nature and of nature's God, rather than British tradition and British constitutional history as their emphasis. An earlier draft of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence has a paragraph that makes the colonists' belief in this idea of local government against a distant parliament even clearer. It falls to a modern reader. It falls away in the revisions, but if you know what to look for in the Declaration of Independence, it's still there. If you look at most of the first few protests in the Declaration of Independence, and again, remember the Declaration of Independence is mostly almost a legal indictment. Count one, the Brits did this. Count two, the Brits did that. If you look at the first few protests against the king and the British government, it's for doing things like obstructing the ability of the colonial legislatures to meet and to act, whether that's vetoing their legislation or directly or via governors. It's making it hard for the colonial legislatures to meet by moving them, or closing them, or blocking their elections. It's deploying bureaucrats without the consent of the colonial legislatures, or quartering troops in the houses of the colonists, again without colonial approval. Later on, the Declaration of Independence summarizes all of this by asserting that the British king has, quote, combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws. And the others who are subjecting us means Parliament, as the violators of American liberty. But our laws and Constitution, unlike Parliament, do recognize this idea of local government, with the U.S. federal government limited in its powers. Protecting our liberty from a government far away was thus a major part of the American Revolution, as well as our Constitution. Such a limited federal government protects individuals' rights, too. You don't have to worry as much about bad people or tyrants taking control of the federal government if its powers are limited. It allows states to try new policies, which if successful can be adopted in other states. It's easier to get agreement at the more local level, or to have common ideas, to go back to the family analogy that I used at the beginning. Keeping these decisions at the state level also allows different communities to make different decisions in line with their different beliefs and environments. You and your family may have very different ideas than the families next door. In other words, this constitutional system recognizes the diversity of America, where we can agree to disagree, where California can be California, Arizona can be Arizona, and within that Constitution, Americans can be Americans. Thank you very much.